Star Wars is a canon-obsessed franchise, but if you're watching this, you probably know that, with today there being canon material and Legends material. Back in 1977, though, there was just a movie which created a successful comic book adaptation that would eventually become an ongoing series running across the duration of the original trilogy. You see, the thing is, for lack of a better term, Marvel was allowed to do whatever the fuck they wanted, since it wasn't until the 90s that Star Wars officially started making canon important. It was all basically meaningless back then. Things like this Marvel comic became S-canon, or the least canon stuff that would occasionally come into play. For example, a small side character from the Empire Strikes Back era of the comic line would eventually become Jason Solo's Sith Master in the Star Wars Legacy series. Basically, some of it counts, some of it is nonsense. I mean, look at Jabba the Hutt in this book. The Marvel adaptation is literally the polar opposite of what Jabba ended up being. So for simplicity's sake, and since I don't think canon much mattered to Marvel here, I'll just start a new section in my Star Wars playlist for the Marvel continuity, or I guess just the Marvel comic books, because even the continuity on this series is pretty inconsistent. Regardless, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. Today we're specifically talking about Marvel's adaptation of Star Wars, or A New Hope as it's now known. Okay, so we all know George Lucas was the father of Star Wars, but also something of a business-minded filmmaker from the very start, which led to Lucas hustling the concept all over the board to try to make this thing a multimedia phenomenon, which we now know would eventually happen. At the time Lucas started pushing the concept, he met with DC Comics and then later Stan Lee at Marvel Comics about an adaptation of the space epic. Supposedly, Stan Lee was open to the idea but wouldn't start putting pen to ink until George Lucas made a film that would be viable to make into a comic. So, 2 years after this 1975 meeting, George had finished his film and had something in hand to present to Marvel, with Roy Thomas being picked to head the project for Adaption. Roy Thomas is a veteran of comics who has been a bit of a journeyman, working on Superman, Captain America, Spider-Man, the X-Men, Batman, and loads of tie-in comics for the industry, including Atari Force in the 70s, Conan the Barbarian, Wizard of Oz, The X-Files, and of course, as we'll talk about today, Star Wars. This man is a tank in the industry and still works here and there. Regardless, after Thomas, a huge comic fan in his own right, was convinced of the project being something he wanted to pursue, he looked for inspirations in other sci-fi comic work like Planet Comics, and he'd start fighting to make the thing a reality, pitching it to Stan Lee further and mentioning that Alec Guinness would play a major role, which ultimately convinced Stan Lee this was some elevated sci-fi. Thomas would enlist Howard Chaykin to do the art for the adaptation, with George Lucas bringing Chaykin in to look at some early concept sketches and the like to help him assemble the style of the book's art. Eventually, the book will be put together across the first 6 issues of the newly minted Star Wars ongoing series, and the rest we'll talk about another day. The story doesn't deviate much from the original film, but adds in some scenes that would ultimately be removed from the final cut of the film. To recap, though, quickly, Leia is captured by Darth Vader since she received the Death Star plans. Leia sends off 2 droids, R2 and C-3PO, to Tatooine to bring the plans to Obi-Wan, an important Jedi from back in the days before the Empire. The droids are taken by Jawas and sold to a farm boy, Luke Skywalker, and his uncle Owen. Owen doesn't want Luke to leave Tatooine, and Luke finds a message from Princess Leia and R2 to find Obi-Wan Kenobi. And when the droid runs off to complete the mission, Luke meets old Ben, who reveals himself to be the Obi-Wan Leia was trying to contact with her message. Aunt Beru and Uncle Owen are scorched. Luke and Obi-Wan meet Han and Chewbacca at the Mos Eisley Cantina. They attempt to bring the info to Alderaan. They find no Alderaan but a Death Star and some debris in its place. Hijinks ensues. They save the princess on the Death Star, and during their escape, Obi-Wan confronts Darth Vader, giving up his life so that the crew can escape. They go to Yavin 4, planning to attack the Death Star's weak point that they found with the Death Star plans. Han dips off, Luke flies the X-Wing, Things are looking bad. Han saves Luke from Darth Vader, disabling the villain's ship. Luke blows up the Death Star. The rebels throw a huge party. The end. The art in this story is okay. It definitely leans into the superhero roots of comics, which I think is unique, but at the same time, I'm more used to the more modern Star Wars comics, which more often than not try to emulate the actors' appearances closely and stuff. Luke especially looks like kind of a He-Man-esque character. In fairness, Howard Chinek is very much in the superhero sphere, working largely up until the 2010s. The art has a very colorful pulp style, which I think works well with the initial inspirations of older sci-fi comics on Roy Thomas for this book, and kind of fits Marvel's thesis in adapting this story. All lightsabers are red in this comic, or rather kind of a pinkish. It's worth noting the sabers are also pretty pointed. This probably has to do with the fact that it was easier to draw, and the production on this book and the film happened simultaneously, with saber colors and design coming in post-production for the film, so it was hard to really know what the color was going to be and what the look was, with Ralph McQuarrie's sabers in the concept art being white, which would have been tricky to do effectively in a comic format with the printing methods of the day. This is loosely why they changed the color of the Hulk to green from the gray of his first couple appearances. This is speculation, of course, but that's probably why the lightsabers look the way they do in this comic. The book has pretty good readability and will take you probably 10 to 15 minutes per issue to read, meaning honestly it fits pretty well from a pacing perspective with what the final film was. I think it hit all the beats it needed to hit very well. I will say there's more internal monologues, which is an important aspect of comic storytelling and was really huge in the Silver and Bronze Age especially. It does get awkward though when Luke is pondering how fucking hot his sister is. I thought that was a little strange, but you get a lot of that in these Marvel Comics issues before Luke made the Luke Leia siblings retcon. The continuity is slightly different than the film, being that it was made off of an early draft, including deleted scenes that we would later see on various releases over the years. But what's probably most notable is that Jabba the Hutt shows up in this comic. This is the look for Jabba the Hutt. This look for Jabba the Hutt would also continue to show up in the comic series here and there, even after his initial appearance, based on the cut scene where Jabba confronts Han and Mos Eisley. But when they initially filmed that scene, they didn't really have anything but a placeholder.
Disappoint me again. I'll put a price in your head so big, you won't be able to go near a civilized system for the rest of your life.
Jabba, you're a wonderful human being.
Nowadays, it's crazy to imagine that Lucasfilm would let something like this happen, where they just write in a seemingly important character. But back then, certain licensors like Marvel had lots of room to do various ideas and really could just do whatever they wanted. It is notable that things like Brian Daley's Han Solo novels did not actually have these freedoms and were so restricted. The only characters they could really use from the films were Han and Chewie, and that, however, worked to their benefit, as they can still be seen as canon to Legends if you so desire. I don't really see how you can ass-pull that Marvel Jabba and film Jabba are the same guy. For prosperity's sake, I will mention the species Jabba is in the early comics is a Nimbanal. Abel G. Pina, a fan and resource book author for the universe, reckoned, or perhaps justified, it as actually being another character, Mosep Benid, who was in the background of A New Hope and later Return of the Jedi, and would be the basis for the Nimbanal species. Perhaps this is true, however. If it was, that would open another slew of continuity issues, especially since his scene confronting Han Solo would later be translated officially into canon, with the special editions having Jabba confront Han, which is now the official version for both the original Legends continuity as well as the modern canon.
Bunky Dunko, let's show ya.
Jabba, you're a wonderful human being.
And if that's the case, why is Han calling him Jabba even months after the events of the film, since we see this version of Jabba intermittently throughout most of Marvel's run? This rabbit hole is getting a little deep, but sometimes you just gotta say, well, that made no sense, and move on. My personal head continuity is that these exist in their own universe that has some very, very loose continuity. Another minor continuity thing was that Luke was part of Blue Squadron instead of Red Squadron. This is also how it was in the original novelization of the film. So I'm guessing that was actually just a change in the final film and not communicated to the publishers at the time people were producing tie-ins. Also, this panel of Obi-Wan's death had me floored. Like, shit's kind of creepy. I don't really have much else to say on this. Frankly, I mostly wanted to talk about this as an artifact of Star Wars comics and as a prelude into looking at the old Star Wars Marvel comics. I find adaptations of Star Wars media really interesting too, since it makes the continuity freaks really lose their mind. No offense to continuity freaks, but like, the Jabba thing is just a strange happening we have to deal with now. Personally, I'll just make a segment in my giant Star Wars Master playlist that's just dedicated to these Marvel things, because I don't even want to try to justify a timeline placement for them. Check that out, by the way, if you're interested in Star Wars stuff. Overall, though, I like it enough, and while it's a bit weird, it's kind of interesting seeing the story adapted to the format of Marvel Comics from the early Bronze Age, and I think as a result it has some charm. Plus, Obi-Wan's death goes so hard. Anyhow, this adaptation would be successful and would lead to a long-running series that lasted 108 issues at Marvel Comics before ending up at Dark Horse, and now it's been back with Marvel for about a decade now. So stick around, eventually we'll talk about those other issues. I've already started writing my pre-Empire Strikes Back issues video, so check back on that very soon.